So once we've identified it, and I think, our answers have given people enough to maybe start that, what does it actually look like? What are those initial steps to healing trauma?
My first one is always counseling, and I know that that is challenging for some people, but I think that when we start to become aware that we have traumatic experiences or we have trauma that we're living with, it can be difficult to even want to go to a friend and say, I started to recognize this about myself. And so will you help me with this? Because a friend is going to maybe be helpful, but at the same time, they're not going to have as much experience or expertise or even a way to guide you to really what needs to happen next. And so I always think that counseling is a good first step, and especially if it's something that you realize that the trauma that you've experienced or that you're living with is probably big trauma. It's even if it might be little things over time, that a lot of times that can be a really good first step. And that could even be counseling with, a mental health professional, but also in a counselor at your church or something, but just somebody who could start to explore that with you yourself. And the reason why I mentioned counseling or even talking with somebody else is that if I try to process something in my own head, I'm only going to come up with the same answers that I always come up with, right? I need somebody else to speak into my situation in a fresh way, give me a fresh perspective, and allow me to think about my situation differently than I would come up by myself. Does that make sense? I also think that if we try to process these things by ourselves, we're more likely to be more dismissive and just play it down rather than really want to get to the core of what's creating this trauma.
Yeah, and again, that's why we talk over and over about the value of groups.
Yeah.
And in the group process with Pure Desire, you're going to have ample opportunities to start processing trauma, naming it, understanding it, and with others, maybe seeing it from a different lens. I think a pattern that we've seen in terms of healing it that is really, and it kind of sounds like steps, but it really can be a fluid process, and it can be something we go through multiple times in healing. But that first step of just naming what happened, like recognizing something in your life that was traumatic. And maybe it's going back and finally naming that my dad's workaholism created a lot of abandonment fear for me. And so you've named and recognized there was something that created trauma. And then I think it's to acknowledge that that was painful. And it's okay that you're not blaming yourself now or, shaming yourself for feeling bad. Like, it's okay that I felt hurt by that I felt some loss. There was a wound there. And it's kind of that grieving process of acknowledging this was hurtful. So we've named it, we've acknowledged it. And then that processing of, what did this make me feel? That's where I think particularly the counselor, a group member, a trusted friend that we can walk through. This is what I remember feeling. This is, and in that process too, it's beginning to invite, where was God in those moments? Where was Christ as you were feeling that? Like, oh, he was with me. And, people have even had ways of kind of walking through that experience and sensing that Jesus was sitting there next to me or he was holding my hand. And another tool I've seen in that area is, and this is kind of a Jenna Riemersma tool of like the All Together You book, of speaking to your inner child, speaking to that part of you that maybe is still kind of stuck at that age and saying, I'm sorry you felt that loss. And thank you for holding this pain for me for so long. Thank you for partnering in that area. And now we're going to work together to heal and learn that we're safe, and we can trust people again and we can take steps. And all that I think is engaged in processing what happened, what we felt, and where were the helpful things. Where was Christ in that moment? What were we, maybe seeing that we survived, and that could be a way of encouragement. Like, I made it through some really hard stuff. Like, I can do hard things. That's always an important lesson in the 7 Pillars of Freedom when we have guys talk about their get up off the floor moments. Like, where in your past did you make hard decisions and you survived? You took the next step and you can do it again. And then, the ultimate step or fourth step is really then how do we start using those points of pain to help others? Because who's more gifted to speak to someone who's stuck in a place of fear or anger or doubt than someone who's walked through it themselves, and beginning to use the parts of your story that maybe you've tried to hide and ignore, to use those as a part of how you're encouraging and helping others. That really is kind of the full circle moment of using your trauma now to be a part of your strength and your story.
Yeah. I also think it's important to identify where you see that trauma being poked currently in your life. I mean, I'm a dad of two young boys, and so it feels like they have trauma pokers they're carrying around every day. But I think identifying that too is helpful in addressing it because it helps me to prepare for those moments. What if I know that they're coming? And then practice doing it differently, not having that overreaction of anger, that underreaction of pulling away and being dismissive. So I think that finding opportunities to have replacement experiences is ultimately how our brain will heal
Hmm.
and how that trauma will heal. And so if you can identify where are these traumas being hit in my life and what are plans of attack or action in those moments that I can do it differently, I think that that's what will start the healing.